Today we are finally checking out the RX 9070 16GB and we're going to be comparing it against the RTX 5070. Now both these cards share the exact same MSRP either from Nvidia or from AMD, but looking at the street prices too, whether you're in the US or in Australia, they're coming in fairly close to one another. And then in the US, you can get the RX 9070 also around about $30 cheaper than the RTX 5070, making it actually slightly less costly when it comes to actual street prices, which we'll talk about that a little bit later, because the value not just on street prices is in favor of the 9070, but also the performance figures, where we'll start off today's benchmarking session with good old Cyberpunk 2077, where we got here at 1440p, a 12% lead for the RX 9070 over the 5070, and then moving on to 4K, it's a 21% lead. So actually that 192-bit bus on the 5070 is starting to show that it's letting up performance versus the RX 9070. Then if we go over to Final Fantasy 16, high settings 1440p, 13% higher FPS for the 9070, then 4K stretches that even further to 17%. So let's continue testing with more benchmarks right after today's video sponsor. Never pay full price for Windows 10 or 11 again with today's video sponsor, VIP STD Keys. You can get activated with the Windows 10 IoT LTSC license, which will last till 2032. Also, don't forget to use the coupon code TYC for a massive 30% discount. And there's also Windows 11 Pro too. Links in the description below. Welcome back to Tech Yes City, and continuing on with the benchmarks here, we've got Marvel Rivals at 1440p high settings with a 9% advantage at 1440p. But then if we move up to 4K, and this is with a 2% advantage, though continue on with Warhammer Space Marine 2, here's where we have a 3% advantage at 1440p for the 9070, and then going over to 4K, it's an 11% advantage. So we're seeing a bit of a trend here where besides Marvel Rivals, things do start to favor the 9070 even more at 4K, but that is, in my opinion, mainly to do with that 192-bit bus versus the 256 that you get on the 9070, not to mention you also get 16GB of RAM versus 12GB of RAM on the 5070. So continuing on with Black Myth Wukong, we got a 10% advantage at 1440p for the 9070. Then at 4K, this then blows out to a 19% field advantage. Then moving on to the last title here for raw rasterization at 1440p high settings with Fortnite, we've got here a 12% advantage for the 9070, and then going up to 4K, this does stretch out a little bit more, going to 15%. Moving on to Rift Breaker, this one actually we're testing with ray tracing on just because the FPS is actually really high to begin with, and this is a 5% advantage at 1440p for the 9070, and then a 2% advantage at 4K. So with the ray tracing numbers for Rift Breaker, I do include it still with the raw rasterization numbers and also include it in the ray tracing benchmarks because it's kind of like a hybrid benchmark. It does ray tracing without tanking your FPS too much. However, when we're summing up now the raw gaming numbers here with the RX 9070 versus the RTX 5070, we got here a 9% advantage at 1440p average across these 7 games. And then if we go up to 4K, it then goes up to a 12% advantage, making it so that the RX 9070 is a better value card if you're just into pure gaming. Now keep in mind, there's also the power consumption testing, which we've done here. And this is where the RX 9070 does stand out above pretty much all other GPUs that I've tested thus far. I think the RTX 5070 Ti was Nvidia's best offering, but then the RX 9070 with its lower power draw out of the box actually does phenomenally well here, not just with the out of the box settings, of course, versus even the RX 9070 XT, but also when you undervolt it, you can then get this thing down to around 170 watts and still get extremely good performance, at least in Warhammer Space Marine 2. Now, for reference, if we were to look at, say, our previous video we did on the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB, in this particular benchmark, that scored 40 average FPS out of the box with a default power consumption of 180 watts. Of course, you can undervolt the RTX 5060 Ti as well, but it's just a cool thing to point out that if you've got someone, say, in your community of friends in your gaming, and they're not undervolting, and you are undervolting, you're just going to get way higher FPS, and you're going to be using less power, and you're doing it on an AMD GPU versus an Nvidia GPU. It's almost like, for me personally, in 2025, the tech enthusiast way of life just spanned into a different multiverse. I recommend it pretty much to anyone out there that wants to take care of their hardware and keep the longevity going for their PC parts. And in this case, undervolting also drops down the memory temperatures on this 9070 right here. Now, in terms of the Steel Legend itself, extremely good implementation of a cooler. Here's where the temperatures are low out of the box. It's not noisy at all. And in fact, if you want to sort of drop those memory temperatures down a bit, which seems like this would be my only critique of the RX 9000 series cards in general, because I've also got an RX 9070 XT from Power Color here, and that's also got relatively higher GDDR6 memory temperatures. And so these going over 80 degrees, I'm just a little bit uncomfortable with that in the long term. I would either choose to undervolt or of course set a higher manual fan speed. And even at these higher manual fan speeds, this card is not going to be annoying whatsoever. Unlike the 5060 Ti Ventus that I tested, that thing was just so unbearable in terms of its fan noise. It's actually the first time I've come in to such a bad and annoying card that I had to talk about that in the previous review that we did. And then you guys in the comments were talking about how bad in general the Ventus cards are. So thanks for sharing that feedback, because that way I know it's not just me when I'm testing these things out and getting these numbers for you guys. I know it's then, okay, that particular model of card, perhaps I should recommend people avoid it. But in terms of the RX 9070 Steel Legend, fantastic card. If you get this particular model, you're going to have no qualms in terms of how it performs, as well as how loud it gets. Now, another thing too about this card is it is mini ITX mountable, at least in terms of its length. But you got to keep in mind it is not a 2-slot cooler. Even though the bracket is 2 slots at the back, it will extend closer to 3 slots than 2 slots. Though for the final benchmarks, we're going to look into ray tracing as well as DLSS and FSR. And this is the big advantage that NVIDIA still has at this point in time, even though if we're looking at just the raw ray tracing numbers, besides Black Myth being the oddity here where the NVIDIA card does do significantly better in percentage terms, the other games are actually kind of neck and neck, like looking at Cyberpunk 2077, Riftbreaker, and also the Veilguard. It actually puts it, if I were to average these 4 games in ray tracing performance, only 5.2% of an advantage towards NVIDIA's RTX 5070. The DLSS 4, this is the advantage that NVIDIA has at this point in time. If you are looking to get better upscaling at this point in time, at least with a general broad across the spectrum gaming experience, you're going to get that with the RTX 5070. Even though AMD has come a long way with FSR 4, I still find in certain titles it is a little bit lackluster. However, in terms of a broader, better experience, I feel like DLSS and especially the Transformer model is doing a better job at this point in time. But keep in mind, when I did turn on Warhammer Space Marine 2, I thought the FSR 4 was phenomenally good on that. So this technology can rival that of DLSS 4. It's just the compatibility and getting it out there that AMD does need to work on. But that said, let's move on now to a conclusion with the RX 9070. And here's where, if you're into raw gaming and just getting the best FPS, not only just the best FPS, but also the best efficiency now, the RX 9070 is going to do the best job of that. Then on top of that, you've got a card that's got an extra 4 gigabytes of VRAM. In terms of the encoders and the decoders, I didn't really talk about this much because they've both got similar capabilities there, even though NVIDIA does have, I believe, a slightly better encoding option, though I will be putting that to the test further when I use an RX 9070 in my main rig. And so I'm going to go through this more thoroughly and make an update video for you guys, talking about the experience of using an RX 9070 in my main system outside of gaming and how that experience was. But that video will be sometime in the future. Don't expect it tomorrow because I've still got to put the card in my main system. So on the flip side of things, if you really need DLSS 4 and that's a big feature for you, then of course the RTX 5070 is there. It does carry currently a higher street price, but keep in mind FSR 3, especially the upscaling portion, is doing a pretty good job in most titles. And then FSR 4, when it works extremely well too. I just feel like AMD is a bit behind in this field, but ultimately when it comes down to both these GPUs, I would personally be picking the RX 9070 just because I've also been having a lot more issues this time around with RTX 5000 series drivers. Just like the power consumption and the efficiency, I find it really odd how AMD's done a switcheroo this generation in that they've got like in the case of the RX 9070, better efficiency, but also more stable drivers, at least when I've been using these RX 9070 and 9070 XTs on my benchmark rig. So really odd to see this behavior, but for instance, I was testing out RTX card while playing Counter-Strike on 11400F in some recent testing, and the whole thing just completely shat itself. I was really surprised, and this happened on the RTX 5090. And then also when I talk to retailers, they're telling me that there's some black screen issues with multi-monitors that are actually happening, and they're having to refund the money on the cards because of the driver issues themselves. So hopefully these things do get fixed with the RTX 5070, but for what it's worth, the RX 9070 and 9070 XT have been actually really solid, and it's just, again, it's really surprising to see that coming out this year with the RTX 5000 series versus AMD's RX 9000 series. So I don't know, guys, let me know in the comment section below if you've had experience with both of these cards and what your experiences are, but in my case, I actually had a much more stable experience on the RTX 4000 series. In fact, it was just rock solid on that GPU lineup from NVIDIA, where I had no complaints whatsoever. It was a really reliable architecture and also driver package, especially coupled in with the GeForce experience versus the NVIDIA app. But then this time around, it seems like AMD's actually got the more stable option. And in the RX 7000 series lineup from AMD, it was the opposite. I was having problems with RX 7000 series. Anyhow, really good to see that AMD and also ASRock with this RX 9070 model in particular are hitting really hard, not just in terms of the overall performance, but also the value, at least being the best value at street prices that you can get a GPU for. So this would be my pick out of all the cards I've reviewed so far up until this date, and it's very impressive to see that. But of course, I am still annoyed at what I believe is a 10% additional surcharge that most gamers are getting charged across the world on these cards, as opposed to, I believe, the prices should be about 10% lower across the board, at least in Australia, where it traditionally has been before these recent launches of GPUs and also outside of the cryptocurrency madness. Now, that being said, very solid card from ASRock. This is also a white edition, and it does have RGB bling included, if that's your thing. But of course, for me personally, there is a switch to turn it off. And on mini ITX rigs, I like to turn off the RGB bling lately because, again, I don't need LEDs adding to extra heat in a mini ITX rig. Anyhow, with all that out of the way, do let us know in the comment section below your thoughts about these GPUs. In fact, any GPUs. Love reading your thoughts and opinions as always. With that aside, I'm going to check myself out. And if you stayed this far and you're enjoying that Tech Yes content, be sure to hit that sub button, ring that bell, and I'll see you next time. Peace out for now. Bye. Woo!